Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
So it's Ron Crabtree here, back as your host of MetaPod, with yet another episode around those three common challenges organizations face. And I don't care what you're doing, you're probably facing issues with forever labor shortage, particularly in North America and most of the Western world, if you will. The need to digitize, digital transformation, the pressure to do that, and then just flat having to do more with less is a massive challenge. And I think you're really going to enjoy what Joe Spadaford's going to be sharing with us today are some insights around this general theme of what's needed to achieve sustainable growth in the face of these three common challenges. So it's a big deal because the old axiom is if you're not growing, you're probably dying, going the wrong way. So definitely moving forward, every organization is looking at some form of growth, be it incremental tortoise versus the hare or rapid versus very steady growth. But growth comes with pain. And if you're trying to grow and you're challenged with not having enough people, not being able to digitize, innovate, or being able to become more productive, just plain do more with less, that's going to be a real challenge. So Joe's going to share some interesting insights with us today. I'm looking forward to that. Joe, tell us a little bit about you.
Thanks, Ron. Good to be with you. So I'm president of J. Francis Consulting, a firm that focuses on working with senior leaders and their teams, taking them through organizational change and transition, using design thinking and operational excellence practices. I've worked in financial services my whole career. I started out in the sort of the control area of banking, became a CPA, but found my real love was running operations and solving operational problems. I've stayed in that part of the world for my entire career at a lot of different firms. The breadth of my experience in banking has allowed me to implement some of the concepts that really drive change today that I'll be sharing with you. And growth in particular is an area where the operating side of the business has a real role to play in helping our companies grow. And we don't think about it often, but the operating model, the execution of the business always falls to operations and their effectiveness. And that can drive growth. So we'll talk about that and cover it in a lot of different perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you. So I think you said something there that we should take a minute and define a little bit. You talked about design thinking. And, our buddy Joe Paris, he's got some pretty good information out there. And he's actually going to be a guest in one of my podcasts, talk more about that coming up in the not too far future. But define what you mean by design thinking just a little bit.
Sure. The way we use design thinking is it's a way to bring in the expertise around a topic without a lot of detail in advance, not a lot of data, but just the experiences of the group, people that have lived through a process. We take them through a structured set of exercises so they can bring out their knowledge, share their knowledge, listen to their colleagues, and help design solutions very quickly that normally would take weeks or months of analysis to do on a formal project. So that's the framework we use. It's about speed. It's about the right people in the room and to be very open and creative in terms of where the discussion will lead you. But there is a structure to it, and that's what makes it work.
All right. Well, that's a little off topic, but that's a new term that's maybe not well understood out there. The other thing I would mention, Joe, before you get started with some diagnostics for us, for the audience, is that what Joe's going to share with us is to some extent evergreen and also extremely industry agnostic. So I really don't care what industry you're involved with. It doesn't have to be manufacturing and distribution. It could be any industry that's going to have significant benefit from what Joe's going to share with us. So Joe, why don't you get started now? If you're, talking to organizations, what would be those top three areas that we should really be looking at with respect to growth in the face of these common challenges?
The areas that I'm going to focus on, there are three of them. One is the value proposition, the importance of the value proposition in really guiding the firm forward with our clients, being responsive to their needs and their view of our firm and why they continue to stay with us and buy our products and services. That's so critical, is even a driver of growth. And we'll chat about that. Second piece of this is the operating model itself. So how does the firm execute against that value proposition? What are the strengths and weaknesses today in execution? And if we are to grow, what needs to be shored up? What do we need to do differently or strengthen to be able to sustain growth? What assets and capabilities do we need to have in place? So the operating model is a big part of our success story and is a driver for growth. And the third piece is the human resource side. I mean, people really need to be part of the journey. They need to understand why the growth is coming. They need to know what the impact's going to be on their jobs, their roles and responsibilities. So they need to be prepared rather than management just assuming that new ways of working or new volumes of work can just be absorbed. That's a mistake.
That's awesome. So let's go back and unpack though one at a time. I know you've got some thoughts here around, what are we looking for if we're going to evaluate how to strengthen, if we even have a gap in our value proposition, and evaluating where we're at and how much work we should pay attention to strengthening that value proposition. What would be your diagnostic? What should we go look for and probe into to understand our gap if we have one?
The real important thing is to have different vehicles for getting to the customer. It's direct customer feedback is the best. So sitting down could be focus groups, could be survey data, perhaps a little bit, could be one-on-one interviews, could be discussions with your sales staff about customer expectations. A lot of different ways to tap into what customers are seeking. Sometimes it's knowledge of your competitors and what they're offering customers. So you want to be in tune with what your customers really, really need to give them benefit from working with you, reduce the pain that they might be feeling for the jobs they have to do and fulfill. So what can we do as a firm to fill those gaps and be the chosen provider for our clients? That knowledge is not fixed. It starts at a point. You've got to continue to evolve it through ongoing communication with your clients. A real example of a company that has done a great job at this is Salesforce. So Salesforce has listened to their customers. They've allowed their customers to make direct suggestions and had those quickly implemented into their software. And that software is then used much more heavily by clients who now are getting more benefit from it. And Salesforce has their revenue model set up based on subscription fees that they assess to clients based on usage. So now you have clients using their software more because it's now been designed in part by the client. And Salesforce is generating very consistent revenues and they're growing. That's the kind of growth model that is a winning formula in today's marketplace. And there are examples of it, but not as many as we like to see.
All right. So let me see if I can sum that one up from a penetration perspective. If I'm an advisor, I'm on the board of directors, or not familiar with, what you just talked about, walking down the hall, I'm looking for evidence. Show me the data and the information. How is it we're listening? The voice of the customer input, right, that drives our future growth. Show me the evidence that we've actually done that in depth. I mean, later you'll tell us how to do it, second part of the podcast here, but you're really looking for evidence that carefully listening to the customer and gathering the information using those different tools needs to be there, and it needs to be fresh, relevant, and continuous, because the only constant is change. We talk about it a lot in the practice of supply chain. How well are we listening to what's going on upstream in the marketplace and able to translate that backward upstream to our suppliers so that we can actually be nimble and agile to respond to changes from the needs of customers. We talk a lot about that in supply chain. So I think it's very important that any industry has, careful self-examination of how well are we listening to the customer, and do we have the data in a continuously evolving data set, I think is what you were saying.
And again, there's no one particular channel for this, but it's using all your multiple connections to your clients. I mean, we like to think in terms of the value chain. The client's experience with our company is a lot of different points in the process. Could be during contracting, could be during sales, could be involved with billing, could be involved with supplier dependencies. So there's a lot of different touch points that the clients have with our organization. All of those experiences matter, and we need to understand how we're executing for the client across that value chain. And so that comes from ongoing contact, communication, surveys. It is a constant thing, but patterns will form. And it's important to think about this too across customer segments. So it's not just an individual client, it's clients that are grouped in segments so that you can make the appropriate organizational changes to help those groups of clients effectively.
All right. Anything else we should examine around strengthening the value proposition before we move on to enhancing the operating model?
Just to share it widely in the organization, not keep it a secret. Everybody knows what really matters to customers in a particular segment. They can focus their own energies and attention toward those areas. And we should measure how well we do in executing internally for the customer as well. That's the way to strengthen teams, give purpose to their mission, and have it all connect to execution for customers.
All right, cool. What should we be looking at with respect to our operating model, assessing where we're at with that?
The operating model framework, every consulting firm has a different way to define the operating model. We use one that comes out of the UK, a fellow named Professor Campbell, who's with the Ashridge Business School in the UK, has developed a framework, and he uses the acronym POLISM, so you can remember it. So it's process, operations, locations, information, and management systems. So that framework has been very helpful to us in working with our clients, looking across the value chain, asking how well are we executing for each of the value chain elements against this POLISM framework. And then we lock in on things that are maybe not so scalable, that need to be scalable, or things where we're not performing at the expectation that clients have for us today. And again, that keeps changing based on expectations of our clients, of the competition, and so forth. But it's a framework that we use over and over again, and we keep asking the questions again, how are we performing? How scalable are we? Because this is about growth. And that operating model has to be constantly thinking about, how do I grow? What pressures is a growth strategy going to put on my suppliers? What bottlenecks exist or could exist if volume suddenly doubles or triples over the next year or two? Just begin to think through those scenarios as part of your growth planning. In fact, it's real important to plan for growth independent of dealing with a growth opportunity. This is really a strategic effort on the part of the organization to look ahead, think about maybe what kind of growth rate do you want to achieve as a company, but also planning for what the impact is going to be on the organization, on your infrastructure. And that's a big failing of a lot of companies today who go after the short term spurt in demand and then fail to think about the downstream consequences. A real good example of that is Peloton during the recent pandemic, when they had a tremendous spike in demand for their bikes, for their treadmills, and they ramped up for it to meet the demand. But then when the demand settled down, they had a bloated cost structure, and there were a lot of issues, service issues that they were struggling to deal with even during the pandemic. So companies need to anticipate better, what the impact on the infrastructure will be if demand should grow as we want it to over time.
All right. So the advice to the audience, what I'm hearing is, again, walking down the hall and asking some questions.
Right.
Show me the evidence that we actually have the data. We've worked through those scenarios. We've anticipated what can and will go wrong. And we've talked about, if we do, achieve the growth goals, what are going to be the bottlenecks and the kinks? So you're looking for other gaps to that. Do we have a really good picture of that? Or is there a gap we need to address going forward? So perfect. So how about that third area you wanted to get into is around engaging in the workforce?
This is, again, when there's a real desire to take advantage of a growth opportunity, the workforce generally doesn't get enough attention. There's an assumption that we can absorb, We can take it on either the way we do our processing or the volume of work that's going to start coming in the door. We can just handle it. We'll sort of work it out as we go. And that really rarely works out. It may sometimes, but the better way is to anticipate growth is going to come. New skills are going to be required. Many growth strategies fail because they didn't anticipate skill requirements in advance. Acquisitions or expansions into different markets where perhaps technology skills are much more important. Your organization may have been weak on those skills for certain segments of your workforce. So you don't want to discover that when you're in the middle of a growth situation. You want to understand it, prepare for it, do the training or do the hiring and recruiting. That's so important. The other thing that is important is to look at the nature of jobs themselves. A lot of research done in the 1970s around job design. And the key theory there is that if you've got a job, you've empowered the individual sufficiently, they understand the significance of their work. The best example of significance is if you're a mechanic working on a jet airline and you're tightening a bolt on the plane, you have a very different view of task significance than somebody that's working at home tightening a bolt on an air conditioner. The same task, but there's a significance to it. So people have to feel what they're doing is important. There's another dimension called wholeness. Do I have a whole job from beginning to end? Or am I just a sliver of the work that's needed to complete a task from beginning to end? So people like to have wholeness in their jobs and feel that they're going to complete something in a full way. And then feedback. Am I getting feedback from the job itself as to how I'm performing? Now, the reason these conditions are important is it creates in the job holder sort of a psychological sense of motivation. It's internally motivated. And it keeps people on the job longer. It gives them greater energy to be productive, and they're just happier in their job. The best example of that is a call center. I mean, most of our experience in call centers, they have pretty high turnover, right? Anywhere between 30, 40%, 2% annually in turnover. Most of us
I worked with one of those 140% turnover. Yep, I know what you're talking about.
Well, I've had a call center, fortunately, that was in my organization, and for 5 years, and it was a complex call center, high-pressure financial services call center. The turnover rate was less than 6%.
That's unheard of.
And the customer service scores were consistently industry leading. And it wasn't about salary. It was about the design of jobs and the way people felt in those jobs. So it's really worth looking at job design across the organization and knowing that if I can succeed in getting my value proposition right, if I can succeed in creating a right operating model, I'm also going to succeed in building a workforce that's going to be with me over the long term, support the growth of the company that's coming, be flexible, and really be participants in our future. And that is what we're after in this strategic thinking about growth.
Yeah, so to sum that one up, I agree with everything you've said. So the first piece is looking out, saying, to support the growth, what kinds of people do we need in various places? Do we have them already or not?
Right.
So what are we going to do to attract and be able to hire those people in the future? And then secondly, you've got to design the work and create the mechanism to listen to employees and engage them so you can close the loop with them. So that's not a snap of your fingers, I can fix that next week. That's months, if not years in the making to get really good at that. So that's what we need to assess. Do we have gaps in those areas? Have we really had, we've got it on paper. Show me what are the jobs we're going to need people in a year from now, 2 years from now. Show me the evidence that we've got the jobs well defined. Show me the evidence that we're listening and we can adjust as we need going forward and get validation back from the workforce that message sent was received as intended, which is one of the breakdowns. 360 communications implies you're listening and adjusting, right? I said this, but did you actually hear what I said? And it's coming back to me correctly. What do people say about you is always great advice, right? What do people say about your company culture is crucial. So that's fantastic. So with that, let's pivot to the meat and the potatoes. Great. So let's pretend that, our audience has listened and they said, yep, I've got a gap, on all three of those areas you're talking about. having a solid value proposition, having a solid operating model that'll allow us to deliver on that and engaging the workforce. What's your practical advice of how do you fix those problems? What do you do if in fact we have those gaps?
You begin to take decisive steps. It's not all going to be solved at once. But in terms of the value proposition, you really, again, want to get close to the customer. Think about how much direct customer engagement is your firm having day to day. Are you inviting customers in for discussions in your firm? Do you make them part of a focus group, even part of the design of a new product or service as an advisory panel? So there are a lot of creative ways you can bring customers into the mix, and many of them would just be delighted to. In fact, most of them probably would be delighted to tell you what they feel and what they hope you can do for them. And creating a robust list of those things, and then really trying to validate which those pain points or which of those desires that customers are sharing are most significant to them. You can't do everything. You need to prioritize that feedback and help it shape your approach to other customers and discussions with other customers. And that's the way you build out a value proposition that will be well received from your customer segments. It's always in relation to a customer segment, your value proposition.
Let me
So
ask you a question there, if I may. Do you have a tool that you've used, or maybe you can tell a story of that in play, a practical story of how that worked? I'm thinking about the Kano model. And if you haven't heard of that, it was developed by a shipbuilding company, a really smart guy in Japan. And they would take a look at an attribute of performance, but they would determine if that attribute of performance was expected. It's platitude. If I say I do that, I would hope you would do that, right? So my windshield wiper will actually clear water off the windshield, right? That's not a differentiator, right? But then what are the aspects of performance that more is better? For example, better gas mileage. More gas mileage is always better, right? So that's something on that curve. And then you've got the true delighters, the things that differentiate the organization, something people want to pay more for. It truly sets you apart and creates the real growth engine. Do you have a mechanism you've used, or maybe you can tell a story about how that worked?
I think it's really in a workshop setting that we've been able to get that out. It's listening. It's not a magic wand. It's just really listening and asking why, why. You don't have to do the 5 whys, but you can drill down on 2 or 3 of the whys and get to a substantive reason why something is important to a client. In other words, just for a client to say, I need, billing is important. Got to get billing right. Well, tell me more about that. Why is billing a real important issue to you? Well, because I have a budget cycle that happens every, 6 months, and I need to know what my future costs are going to be in June. Oh, so you're saying our billing frequency doesn't line up with your budget cycle? Yes, that's my problem. Okay, well, we can deal with that. But if a person just said he had problems with billing and didn't give you a whole lot more than that, where do you go with that? So it's really drilling down, trying to understand the reason behind a client's preferences and teasing those out and then validating them again with the client and then accommodating where you can those requests. That's the same process for the big issues as it would be for the small issues that clients have. And the more that you can codify and generalize within your value proposition, because it could apply to multiple clients, then you have something that maybe separates you from the competition.
All right, awesome. I'm sorry if I knocked you off your thought trail, but I'm just really curious about that one. So
Yeah.
please continue.
Okay, so on value proposition, I think we've hit some of the main areas. Obviously, again, and I think you said it, Ron, it's got to be a continuous process because customers change, the environment changes, competition changes. So just because you have it in your customer brochures, what your value proposition is, that's pretty static. You've got to have one that's a little more alive and is shared widely within your organization. And in fact, you're going to drive future growth strategy off the value proposition. And the reason that's so important is companies have drifted from their core values. We know examples, Sears, Kodak, Blockbuster. These were firms that had a value proposition and they decided to get into something totally different and expand. And sometimes it led to bankruptcy. And the winning companies who know how to grow stay with their value proposition. They grow it, They make improvements. They're innovating in that space, making life easier for customers, removing the friction. And so that's the key. Strengthen the value proposition, then keep innovating within that, expand it and make it work for the customer and make it work for you. But that's what you do well. Don't give up on what you do well as you grow. Always look for a way to apply it to your next opportunity. Lead from your strength, and that's how you're going to have sustainable growth.
Awesome. Anything else from an advice perspective you'd like to get into in this podcast?
The one area, in terms of the operating model,
Yeah, thank you.
I'm a believer in speed. It's so important to get people focused in a short period of time on a problem where you have their attention and you put them through a process that allows them to do whatever analysis is needed to understand the problem and then come up with appropriate solutions to the problem. That needs to happen quickly. And the reason is everybody gets distracted and there are too many other things competing for their attention. So we have a 2-day workshop that we designed for operating model. We get all the right SMEs in the room. We take them through a series of structured exercises, and they lead to a set of outcomes that allows the firm then to direct project activities to really a slice of the organization where change is required. And that can happen very quickly. In a 2-day period, we've got direction, we've got collaboration then by the stakeholders, and that can accelerate then a more transformation-oriented change effort that needs to follow. But doing a front-end workshop to a major change effort is highly recommended. And it just solidifies why you're doing change, what the change should be, and it gets the stakeholders on board even before the heavy lifting begins.
Do you have a guideline, Joe, in terms of the speed of implementation? I make the argument that, if you can't do something inside of 90 days, your chances of success are going to drop off quickly because of two reasons. One, it's hard to keep an organization focused. Number two, everything's changing, right? So assumptions that are valid today may not be valid again 90 days from now.
I'm with you 100%, Ron. I think you've got to have 30, 60, 90-day game plan. And you want to see immediate, you can get immediate results, even if those results are just engagement type results, getting people involved, measuring things, reporting out how we're doing. The biggest motivator in an organization, and I'm sure you've come across this too, is progress. If people believe they're making progress, they're going to work harder to make more progress. And so I think it's real important to set benchmarks, near-term, quick things out of the gate, but also having a strategic runway. So the sequence of change that's required, and you build on that. But keep reporting the progress in every phase, the little progress, the big progress, and also how customers are perceiving you executing. So they know
Listening.
listening.
As you're getting the feedback that's validating you're on the right track.
Right. And customers know how you're executing. They know when you're failing and they know when you're succeeding. So having ongoing customer feedback could be in surveys or interviews, but having quarterly or some frequency of customer feedback, scoring you on how you're executing, and then playing that back to customers. So don't just take it and play it back to them and then talk about what you're doing to address issues they may have had, or just showing them how you've improved since they raised issues with you before. Very powerful. It's both powerful as an internal motivator and it's powerful with your customer retention and their belief in you. And it all works to feed your growth engine the right way.
Awesome. This has been great stuff. Anything else from an advice perspective you might offer before we get into wrap up?
I think we've hit all the things I wanted to cover on. So
Yeah, you did a really good job. When we talked about engaging the workforce, I think you just did a really logical, you knew to determine whether or not we're doing those things, but then what to do is kind of self-evident. If you don't have the work design, if you don't have the training, you don't have the feedback systems that listen to employees, that's the gap, all right? So obviously those are the go-dos. So Joe, this has been fantastic. And there's some really good pieces in here. I don't care what industry you're in, but if you got to grow, These are the key areas you've got to be thinking about. So I'm completely in alignment with that. So if people want to pick your brain, get in touch with you, learn more about how you might approach the problems or just kibitz, how do they get in touch with you?
Just reach out to me, send me an email, or give me a direct call. I'll put my cell phone in there as well. I love this topic. So if I can help with your own thinking through it and then your firm, be happy to do so. Thank you.
Joe, thanks for joining me.
Okay, Ron, my pleasure.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.